ESG and CSR, navigating stakeholder expectations.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all having a good time. It's a pleasure to be here. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that's really close to heart and what I consider to be a key topic then, or an opportunity, if you like, then for the industry. We've got a really good panel then here today. So there's Rachel Decelis, who's our ESG lead at KPMG Malta. We've got Martina, Cutajar, the senior ESG advisor at ARQ Group, and Yuliya Khrenova, head of compliance and DPO at iGaming Academy. And our topic today is ESG and CSR, navigating stakeholder expectations. Now, the reality is, as we start to see ESG become more and more mainstream, not only does it pose an opportunity for the industry, there's also a pressing need, given the rise of CSRD then, for European-based operators. So just before we start, if we were to provide a quick overview as to what ESG is, ESG, at least the way in which we tend to define it, is an evaluation of a firm's collective consciousness, right? And it has a wide range of scoring and non-financial performance scoring criteria that assess, one, the sustainability of a business, and secondly, the impact of a business's products and services on that of planet and society. Now, this is where we start to look at elements like RG, etc., which we'll start to be delving into. But the important thing is that no business operates within a vacuum. Every action generates risks and rewards. So by clustering these actions into the pillars of E for environment, S for social, and G for governance, helps a business better identify, monitor, and manage its actions and its obligations from an ESG standpoint. So I'm conscious of time, so let's kickstart then straight away. And if I could just starting with you, Raish. In one sentence, what do you think is the most pressing ESG challenge in online gambling today?
Thanks for that, Ras. So in our interactions with online gaming clients, particularly the bigger ones and the listed ones, the key challenge that is being faced is compliance with regulations. So as many in the audience will be aware, there's new regulations that have come in and that are coming in. Particularly the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And it's a bit of a mouthful, this directive. There's a lot to be done with a materiality assessment, with collecting data, with getting your disclosures assured for the very first time. So just very briefly, that I think would be the biggest challenge being faced at the moment.
Thank you. Martina?
So further to what Rachel was saying, apart from the compliance side of things, I think is balancing out the profits with actually being sustainable. So finding that nice balance between the two aspects and ensuring that your business is sustainable in the long term in its functions as well.
Absolutely. I think the coin is profitable sustainability and finding that balance. Yuliya?
I believe, as much as I agree that sustainability is extremely important for any business, but the biggest problem that I see in the iGaming industry right now is the majority of the stakeholders, especially if they're small to middle-sized businesses, they do not quite understand why ESG is important for their business. If you're not going to be listed and you are not going to later on do a successful M&A, if you're not going to sell your business and you operate in the country where the ESG requirements come advisory, like an optional, for example, the ESG code, which was published by the MGA beginning of this year, and in opposition to some countries where it's actually imposed, like Germany, for example. If you operate from here, from Malta, and you hear it from each and every corner this year, everybody tells you, we need to implement ESG. Are you going to participate in the ESG, initiative? Are you going to implement the reporting? The majority of businesses just sit down and they ask themselves, do I need to do this? Because if you look at all the criteria, you will clearly see that the majority of the requirements, let's be honest, already covered either under your licensing conditions or under the compliance requirements and the best practice standards. So for most companies, it becomes an extra, let's say, compliance burden and an extra paperwork to implement it within the operational framework.
I think that's a super fair point. And so we see some clusters of groups that are taking ESG and embracing it and trying to become more sustainable driven businesses, others that do see it more as a tick box exercise. And then there's a section then of people or organizations that wonder why they should bother in the first place. And I think one of the examples we've seen as well, even taking a page outside the gambling industry, is even if you fall out of scope from a CSRD element, even if you disregard the benefit that it presents to the gambling industry, you look at big groups like McDonald's, for instance, today. They're having to go off to all of their suppliers, big or small, whether they're having to comply with CSRD or not, and they are forcing them to fulfill then certain requirements, because the reality is if their value chain fall foul of these requirements, it's going to impact McDonald's. So there's pressures which are direct and indirect. Thank you. I'm going to open up the question. Just feel free to start off and to contribute as needed. But what would you say are the biggest challenges online gambling organizations face when integrating ESG strategies into their core business operations? And I know you started, Martina, with profitable sustainability. Would you like to build on this question? Feel free to treat it as a fireside.
Sure. So I think further to the profitability aspect, we were mentioning the supply chain. So it's integrating all what your suppliers and stakeholders are demanding of you, even if you're maybe not within scope for the time being, while managing your financial sustainability as well. So trying to find the balance with all the requirements of your suppliers, what your stakeholders are wanting as well from the gaming experience. We're living in a very technological world, so we want everything at the tip of our fingers. Everything needs to be, very fast, ease of use as well. So finding those balances and incorporating what the stakeholders are, I think, is the biggest challenge at this point in time, also because the requirements are still evolving. So stakeholder needs might change and expectations might change from 1 year to the next. So keeping within those requirements as well is, I think, a challenge for them.
Agreed. Would anyone like to add on to that?
I think what Yuliya said about really identifying the benefits of implementing ESG, I think that's still a bit of a challenge sometimes. So it's like there's this stumbling block. Okay, but how much is this going to cost me? And if we look at ESG from a purely reporting standpoint or from a purely compliance point of view, then it's just going to be a cost exercise. But if we look at ESG from a value-adding perspective, then that takes us into a whole different territory. It allows us to focus on the things that actually add value and that actually mean something to stakeholders. And this is where we can enhance the customer experience, as Martina is saying. Exactly. We can have conversations with our lenders about how sustainable we're being. We can attract investors on the basis of our sustainability credentials and so on. So.
And I think that's a really great point, because very often when we look at the industry, we typically associate the major stakeholders being the regulators, the operator, and the customers. But we're looking at suppliers, partners, those are your affiliates, right? You're looking at your employees, your capital markets, your media businesses. So each one of these factors are contributing to the direction that organizations are having to take into consideration. An example is even investors are demanding more insight into what the metrics and the KPIs are from an RG angle. It's one thing to say we are very RG compliant, but what does it actually mean? How are you being transparent? What are the factors that are fueling it? And what's the ambition?
We're even seeing rating agencies classifying companies according to their ESG credentials, and these scores from rating agencies like S&P are being used in making investment decisions as well. So this is something important to keep in mind.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that we found is that for an effective ESG strategy to come into play, it really needs to be lived and breathed by the CEO. Very often we find executives are trying to say, well, it's not my responsibility. The reality is it sits with the CEO to have an effective strategy. And the reason for this, it goes back onto Martina's point of the profitable sustainability. You've got commercial teams that may be having bonuses tied to certain revenue, and then you've got an ESG team, and if they're isolated and not backed by the likes of the CEO, they're going to be pushing things on this commercial team where they're going to be pushing back, saying there's no way I'm going to reel that in because that's going to impact my bottom line. So it's a culture aspect. Martina, can you share any successful examples that have come to mind from a profitable sustainability angle? Is there a company that you've seen have done this particularly well?
So recently we've seen the different seals come out from the MGA. So I think all of those companies see the profits, the financial sustainability that come with ESG. Otherwise, they would not have gone for the voluntary compliance. But we've seen as well companies that have integrated and have found ways of integrating AI tools, for example, that are making the user experience much better for the customers while being allowed to see the human nature. So being able to see how the player is also reacting to the emotionality that comes with a fast-paced and user-friendly experience. So obviously having systems that are incorporated into the game structure as well will allow responsible gaming to be taken more seriously as well through these AI tools. So these are things that we've seen in the market as well. And we're living in an age where there's very little you can do with AI. And I think that is the next step and the secret maybe to going that further step with responsible gaming and being still profitable within your functions.
Yep, sounds good. Raish, how does stakeholder engagement shape an ESG strategy, particularly in relation to double materiality?
Okay, so the concept of double materiality really came to light under the CSRD. So the CSRD requires an organization to look at the impacts it has on planet and on people, and on the risks, the financial risks and opportunities that are generated by ESG considerations. And of course, it can be just an inward-looking exercise, right? Just done by somebody in a corner office or in a dark room on their own and doing a materiality assessment by themselves. But that's not really productive, is it? So what we typically do is we map out the key stakeholders for a business, which might vary, but typically these would include customers, for example, employees, investors, lenders. Banks particularly are having a keen interest in ESG considerations because they themselves are under pressure from the European Central Bank, the European Banking Authority and so on to report on ESG metrics, to have a decarbonization plan in place and so on. We could have suppliers and partners being important stakeholders, the media to a lesser extent perhaps, but we know that media picks up news of adverse reports in the gaming industry as well, and of course regulators. So what is typically done and what is best practice in a materiality assessment approach is to consider the existing means of engagements that you have with these stakeholders. What do you already know? What are your customers already telling you? What are your employees already telling you? Perhaps you do an annual people survey, for example. What can you find out through research? And figuring out what matters to these employees, to these stakeholders rather. For example, we did a KPMG survey last year where we try to identify some of the values that customers of the gaming space resonate with. And amongst others, these came to things like trust, value, enjoyment, and player protection. So if you want to be a sustainable and resilient business into the long term, and I'm not talking now just about ESG, but actually a profitable business into the future, how can you have a strategy that does not incorporate what your customers want and what your employees want? So it's absolutely crucial.
And that is part of the bottom line impact and benefit that this can bring when you're looking at the medium and long-term strategy. So like even if you take another example from outside the industry, like Patagonia, which is the outdoor clothes company, they decided to create to invest part of their profits or revenues into safeguarding the environment. Now this was a philanthropic endeavor, which was true for them because their employees believed in it, their customers believed in it. And when we look at the gambling sphere, we know that the gambling sphere is starting to invest more in this kind of space. But sometimes I feel as though it's kind of a shot from the hip. Does it actually have the actual impact that one may hope? So, Yuliya.
Can I say something on this?
Yeah,
because
please.
you said the gambling industry starts slowly investing in these programs. The problem with the gambling industry is it's surrounded by lots of stigmatization. And by law and as a regulation, they usually tell you as a gambling company, because you are high risk and because you are harmful from the social perspective, you have to pay contribution to certain charities, support centers, counseling services and such. And the problem is when they tell you that you are obliged doing this, it's very difficult to have a different sort of conversation on the senior level of management to say that we are willing to do this because we see value, not because we have to, because it was our internal decision.
Yes. Yep. Agreed. Okay. I'm conscious of time over here, so I'm going to open up then the question then as well. What are the most effective tools or metrics for gaming companies to measure their ESG impacts, and how should they showcase this to stakeholders? Would anyone like to take this on?
I think it's a very difficult question when it comes to gambling. Obviously, you can measure profitability, you can measure retention of the customers, you can measure the value of your average customer base. But the problem is, in my opinion, we lack awareness, education, and understanding of the ESG topics, especially when it comes to the social part of this topic, and the impact it might be on the responsible gambling, on the player protection, and to fight the stigmatization we have around the industry. Because even though we try to implement all these areas, globally, the problem gambling just keeps growing, and because of the stigmatization, because of lack of their understanding of the psychology of problem gambling, addiction, the process that happens and leads to this, statistics is not actually very bright. Like, it's extremely bad if we look at it from gender gap, from pay gap. Only 2% of women who struggle from problem gambling to some extent seek professional support, simply because they face more stigmatization when they turn for professional help. Our understanding of vulnerabilities, including behavioral, situational, financial vulnerabilities, is still not where we would love it to be, although as part of the responsible gambling, many regulators, including UK, Netherlands, Malta, Belgium, they tell us you need to identify the vulnerable categories of customers, but they do not tell us how to identify the vulnerable categories of customers. We need to raise awareness about the pay gap because it's important to calculate the affordability of the customers as a direct requirement under the RG. We need to understand where we can rely on the statistical information about the income, the profitability of the businesses, again, to understand the financial risks for the customers and for the business, to balance the profitability of the business and the satisfaction of the customer services. We still need to provide more training to our employees, simply because our employees should know how to cope with these situations. They should know how to approach the customers. It's extremely important to implement higher standards across maybe mental health and support for the employees in general, measuring their KPIs, but also measuring their satisfaction to prevent the burnout.
Yes.
Because if you work in the gambling industry and you're in a customer-facing position and you're dealing with people who might be struggling from the problem gambling as a result of directions that your commercial department took, you are in a very complicated position, let's say, because you become the buffer who absorbs everything from both sides.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've just run out of time. So I thank you all then for listening in. Thank you to the panelists. Please give the panelists a nice round of applause.